Freezing to death in a trench should take hours. Your judgment goes first, quietly. You start making decisions that feel reasonable and are actually killing you. Unbuttoning your jacket because you suddenly feel warm. Closing your eyes for just a minute. Yet Soviet soldiers survived months inside the ruins of Stalingrad through the most brutal urban winter in modern military history. Minus 40 degrees. No heated barracks, no adequate uniforms. No mercy from the temperature or the Wehrmacht. What did they figure out that modern survival experts still don't teach? The answer is stranger than you'd expect. And some of it is still embedded in Russian military doctrine today, without anyone mentioning where it came from. It came from Stalingrad, from men who had no choice but to solve the problem or die. Here's the thing about minus 40 degrees. Now it's the one temperature where Celsius and Fahrenheit converge. Same number. Both scales. That's not a quirk of trivia. That's the universe issuing a formal warning. Exposed skin freezes in under 10 minutes. Rifle bolts freeze in their receivers. A Soviet soldier had to account for all of that every single night with a German MG 42 40 meters away and a sniper who'd been watching the same window for 3 days. The Germans arrived in Stalingrad in summer uniforms. That promise from Hitler's high command that the campaign would be over before winter killed tens of thousands before a single Soviet bullet touched them. The Soviets knew what was coming. What they didn't have was enough gear, enough food, or enough time, so they improvised. What they improvised became the most sophisticated wartime cold weather survival system ever developed under combat conditions. The destruction of Stalingrad accidentally created the most effective survival architecture in wartime history. When German bombers reduced the city to debris, they weren't just destroying buildings. They were unintentionally constructing a survival landscape that would ultimately defeat them. Collapsed reinforced buildings don't flatten evenly. They create pockets, air cavities between concrete slabs, broken brick and twisted rebar. Spaces where air gets trapped and stays still. And still air doesn't steal heat. Moving air does. A wind at minus 40 degrees kills. Still air at minus 40 degrees is survivable? Barely, if you have a heat source inside it. At Stalingrad, that heat source was the human body. Soviet soldiers called these spaces nori, dens, the word for an animal's burrow. They stopped thinking like soldiers and started thinking like foxes. You don't fight the temperature. You find a hole and disappear into it. 3 men in a sealed rubble pocket could raise the interior temperature by 25 degrees using nothing but body heat and breath. 3 men in the open at minus 40 degrees are a survival emergency. 3 men in a concrete pocket might make it to morning. The battlefield shrank to the size of a sleeping space. Winning that smaller battle is what made the larger one possible. Here's the edge the Soviets had. Stalingrad was their rubble. They knew which collapsed buildings had accessible pockets, which tunnels connected which sectors, which basements had survived the bombing. The Germans had better boots and heavier coats. But by January, they were dying in open positions because they didn't know where the holes were. They'd destroyed the city, but never learned to read it. The Soviets were reading it like a map they'd drawn themselves. The Germans had firepower. The Soviets had geography. Geography won. But rubble pockets only buy you so much. When temperatures drop past minus 35 degrees and stay there for days, you need heat generation. And generating heat in a combat zone, without light, without smoke, without anything detectable by enemy observation, is where Soviet ingenuity gets genuinely remarkable. The fat-loading protocol. Soviet field kitchens at Stalingrad ran on one principle above everything else. Fat. Not balanced nutrition. Not variety. Concentrated animal fat consumed in the largest quantities a human digestive system could handle before nightfall. Lard. So rendered pork fat. Salo carried in packs. Sunflower oil straight from the container. Sounds brutal by modern standards. By Stalingrad standards, it was medicine. Here's the biology. Digesting fat produces more internal heat than any other macronutrient. The process is slower, more demanding, and burns longer. A soldier who ate a heavy fat meal 2 hours before sleep would hit peak heat production right around 2 to 3 a.m. That timing wasn't accidental. Soviet nutritionists attached to frontline units had calculated it deliberately. The coldest window of a winter night hits between 3 and 4 a.m. That's when a sleeping body is most vulnerable. By timing fat consumption to peak during that exact window, Soviet soldiers were programming their own metabolisms as thermal management systems. 4 to 6 hours of slow-burning internal warmth from a single meal at the right moment. The official ration included 100 grams of fat per soldier per day. Modern guidelines suggest 65 for a sedentary adult. Nobody cared about cardiovascular health in 1942. Fat was the most weight-efficient thermal protection available. A kilogram of lard provided more hours of warmth than any blanket the Red Army could manufacture and distribute. Now, what about vodka? The famous 100-gram ration was real, psychologically important, but the soldiers who survived longest learned to drink it at dawn, not at midnight. Alcohol dilates blood vessels, pulls warm blood to the skin surface, feels cozy for 20 minutes, then radiates your core heat into the frozen air like a broken radiator. And men have died in every winter war, thinking whiskey was saving them. At Stalingrad, understanding that difference was itself a survival skill. The 3 a.m. watch system Soviet trench units built a rotation system around one brutal physiological fact. The human body reaches its lowest core temperature between 3 and 4 a.m. Metabolism slows. Blood pressure drops. In a minus 40-degree trench with marginal insulation, that window is when hypothermia stops being a word in a medical text and starts being a process happening inside your chest. So, 1 man in every 3 stayed semi-conscious during that window, not watching for Germans, watching for his own men, watching for one specific sign. When a man stops shivering, that's the emergency. Shivering is miserable and violent, and it is also your body fighting. When it stops, either the person has warmed up or the body has given up. In a minus 40-degree trench, it's almost never the first option. A man who stops shivering needs immediate intervention. Physical contact, forced movement. The watching soldier would press against the cooling man, force him to speak, to move, to stay present. One body's heat transferred through direct contact can restart the shivering reflex, restart the fight. By another 2 hours. NKVD reports from the battle actually document this. Companies that maintained thermal watch rotations through December and January showed measurably lower cold casualty rates than companies that abandoned the system when officers were killed and the structure collapsed. Most men who died of cold at Stalingrad didn't die alone. They died in groups that had stopped watching each other. Exhaustion breaks the system. And once the system breaks, the cold doesn't wait for anyone to reassemble it. The newspaper armor. Soviet soldiers in 1942 received the Telegreka, a padded quilted jacket filled with cotton batting, designed for cold weather operations, effective down to approximately minus 20 degrees with reasonable activity levels. Below that threshold, particularly during static nighttime positions with minimal movement, the Telegreka alone was insufficient. The gap between what issued gear could handle and what the weather was actually doing had to be bridged with whatever was available. The solution was so simple and so unglamorous that it took decades to appear in the Western military histories. Newspaper, specifically sheets of Pravda, Krasnaya Zvezda, and whatever other print material could be salvaged from the bombed-out offices and apartment buildings of Stalingrad, stuffed in multiple layers between the Telegreka and an outer layer of whatever additional clothing a soldier possessed. Insulation layers work by one mechanism: trapping still air. The material itself is almost irrelevant. What matters is immobile air, caught in gaps between fibers, between layers, between pages. A soldier who stuffed 4 layers of newspaper under his outer jacket was not doing something improvised and desperate. He was applying intuitively the same physical principle that underlies every sleeping bag, every down jacket, every insulated wall panel ever manufactured. He was creating dead air pockets. and dead air pockets don't conduct heat away from the body. Soviet field hospital records from Stalingrad, portions of which were declassified in the 1990s, show that soldiers presenting with improvised multi-layer insulation, including newspaper, reported significantly lower rates of torso and core frostbite compared to those relying solely on issued gear. The data was noticed. Post-war Red Army cold weather doctrine explicitly incorporated improvised insulation techniques, tracing their documented effectiveness directly to Stalingrad. The newspaper trick entered official military knowledge through the back door of necessity. The German Sixth Army learned about these techniques eventually. Soldiers captured and interrogated described Soviet layering methods. German command understood what was being described. Now, by the time that knowledge filtered up through the chain of command and back down in the form of guidance, the encirclement at Stalingrad was complete. The Germans were trapped inside a shrinking perimeter, with inadequate gear, inadequate food, and no route of supply. Knowledge is only a weapon if you have time and resources to act on it. By January 1943, the German Sixth Army had neither. The Mutual Heat Protocol. Nobody survives a Russian winter alone. That statement is not philosophy or sentiment. It is physics with a body count attached to it. A single resting human body produces roughly 80 watts of thermal energy. Two bodies in a shared sealed space produce 160 watts. Three produce 240 watts. In a rubble pocket sealed against wind infiltration, three men sharing body heat and a single wool blanket between them can maintain a microclimate that is survivable, even when external temperatures are beyond what any single piece of issued equipment alone can manage. The system requires all three men. Remove one and the math changes in ways that can kill the remaining two. Soviet veterans of Stalingrad described in memoirs, written decades after the battle, a practice of sleeping pressed together in groups of three, rotating positions through the night so that the man occupying the outside position, directly against the cold wall of the rubble pocket, would cycle inward every 2 hours. The outside position was physiologically dangerous. The inside positions were relatively protected, so they traded, not out of warmth toward each other in the emotional sense, though bonds formed in that context were famously durable, but out of the kind of cold arithmetic that combat strips human relationships down to. If the man on the outside dies, the system loses a heat source. The remaining two men now face a harder thermal calculation with fewer resources. Self-interest and mutual survival were the same thing. The system encoded that reality into a behavioral protocol that kept all three alive more reliably than any of the three could have managed independently. This element of the Stalingrad survival story is the one that receives the least attention in popular histories. The battle is documented obsessively for its tactical innovations, its political dimensions, its role in turning the war. The fact that it was survived, in significant part, through systematic mutual warming protocols maintained under fire by exhausted soldiers who understood intuitively what the math required of them. That part tends to get compressed into a line about Soviet resilience or Russian toughness, phrases that obscure more than they explain. It wasn't toughness in the abstract. It was a specific set of behaviors, developed under pressure, maintained through collective discipline, and effective enough that the men who practiced them came out of Stalingrad, while better-equipped men who didn't practice them did not. What survived the battle? So what actually kept Soviet soldiers alive in the most lethal winter battle in human history? It was rubble architecture and dead air pockets. It was fat metabolism, timed to peak heat output during the coldest hour of the night. It was rotation systems that kept someone half-conscious watching for the specific physiological signs that the cold was winning. It was newspaper layered under quilted cotton. It was three men sharing one blanket, trading the cold side every 2 hours because the math demanded it and survival left no room for anything else. None of these techniques required advanced technology. None of them required supply chains that weren't already broken. All of them required understanding, clear-eyed and unsentimental, of what the cold was doing and what the human body could do about it. The soldiers who developed these techniques were not trained survival specialists. They were factory workers and farmers and students who had been handed rifles and sent to hold a city on the Volga River against the most powerful army in Europe. And they figured it out the hard way, which is to say, they figured it out by watching what happened to the men who didn't figure it out. The German Sixth Army had better gear, better rations at the start, better training in conventional terms. They lost 300,000 men at Stalingrad. The Soviets held the city. The winter was the same for both sides. What was different was what each side knew, and when they learned it, and whether they had the structure to act on it, when the temperature dropped past the point where everything becomes the same number on two different scales. The cold doesn't care about ideology. It doesn't respond to courage or equipment budgets or strategic planning. It responds to physics. And at Stalingrad, the men who understood the physics well enough to survive them changed the course of the war. They just didn't call it physics. They called it getting through the night. One more time, until morning came. Stalingrad ended in February 1943. The German Sixth Army surrendered in pieces, frostbitten and starving. Men who had once been the edge of the most feared military force on Earth, reduced to shuffling columns heading east into captivity. The Soviets who accepted that surrender were the same men who had spent months in rubble pockets, sharing newspapers and lard and body heat in the dark. What those survivors carried out of the city wasn't just a victory. It was a body of practical knowledge that had been stress-tested at -40 degrees against a live enemy with artillery. You cannot replicate that curriculum in a training facility. You cannot simulate the specific pressure that produces those solutions. The knowledge was valid precisely because the conditions that created it were unsurvivable by any other means. Red Army doctrine writers spent the post-war years quietly incorporating what Stalingrad had taught: cold weather rotation protocols, and improvised insulation procedures, fat loading schedules for winter operations, thermal watch assignments built into unit structure. None of the official manuals credited the source directly. Military doctrine rarely does, but the fingerprints of Stalingrad are in every line of it, in every protocol that assumes soldiers will treat each other as thermal assets before they treat each other as anything else. The German military studied Stalingrad too. Every serious military institution in the world studied Stalingrad. What they extracted were mostly lessons about encirclement and logistics, and the danger of ideological interference in operational command decisions. The cold weather survival system, the granular behavioral protocols that had actually kept Soviet infantrymen alive through January, those rarely made it into the case studies. Too unglamorous, too small, lying too far from the level where generals make decisions that historians want to analyze. So the knowledge survived, but incompletely, absorbed into doctrine in fragments, compressed into the phrase Soviet resilience in the histories, misattributed to toughness when it was actually technique. The men who developed it are gone. The rubble they learned it in was cleared and built over. What remains is the method, still functional, still physically sound, waiting in cold weather manuals and military libraries on 3 continents. Most readers unaware they are looking at something that was figured out one brutal night at a time by men with no margin for being wrong. The cold at Stalingrad did not break on a single morning. It retreated the way it always does, slowly, grudgingly, giving ground the way the Germans eventually did, degrees at a time across weeks. The men who made it to March had survived something that had no right to be survived. They didn't emerge changed in the ways that war stories usually describe. No sudden clarity about the meaning of life. No peaceful resolution of what they had witnessed. Mostly they emerged hungry and exhausted, and in need of things as basic as dry socks and uninterrupted sleep. The profound experiences were there, underneath, but the body's immediate demands crowded out whatever the mind wanted to process. Survival is like that. The full weight of what happened arrives later, when you finally have the stillness to feel it. What they had was each other, not in a sentimental sense that makes for good film dialogue, in a literal sense. The man who had pressed against you through the coldest hour of every night for 3 months had been, without exaggeration, a component of your survival system. You knew the sound of his breathing. You knew when it changed in ways that required you to act. You had watched for his shivering, and he had watched for yours. And neither of you had let the other slip past the point of no return, not once, not on the worst nights, not when the temperature and the exhaustion and the weight of everything converged at 3 a.m. with the wind dead and the cold absolute. That relationship doesn't have a clean name. Brotherhood is too soft. Partnership is too corporate. What it actually was is something the language of peacetime doesn't have good words for, because peacetime doesn't produce the conditions that require it. They got through the night. Then they got through another one. Then another. Until there were enough mornings stacked behind them that Stalingrad became the past instead of the present, and the techniques that had kept them alive became memory instead of practice, and the cold became something that happened once instead of something that was always about to happen again. But the knowledge stayed with them. And in the doctrine it entered, and in the manuals written by men who had either been there or learned from men who had, in the cold weather protocols still practiced by militaries that inherited pieces of what was figured out in that rubble, some version of it is still out there. Getting through the night. One more time until morning comes again, till